Hello, welcome to week 3. This week we're talking about race, gender, colonialism, and the two Godzilla movies. Some key concepts I want to go over. I want to explore how gender ideologies work in relation to the genre of each of these films. I want to compare and contrast the politics of each film. I want to understand the frameworks for reading race and colonialism in film, understanding Diawara's idea of the black or resisting spectator. And I'd like you to think too about a connection between U.S. environmental military colonialism and gender ideologies, which these films, these two Godzilla films, are sort of dealing with. So to begin with, I just want to go over Robert Stamm and Louise Spence's piece very briefly. The authors propose some strategies for analyzing and interpreting representations of race and colonialism on screen. And one reason I wanted to assign this week for this course is that they're actually building on feminist frameworks. But I also want to ask where we might see some of these ideas playing out in any of the films we have watched so far, including the two we've watched for this week. For example, how does the 1998 Godzilla represent non-Europeans in Panama and Jamaica? The authors note how the camera can inscribe features of European colonialism and can work to position the spectator as a conqueror, very similar to Mulvey's idea of the male gaze, right? The authors also point out how the first world can possess the gaze, while the third world subject operates as the object of the gaze. In Westerns, for example, Native Americans are often represented as invaders in their own land, surrounding the pioneering wagon train. Hollywood also frequently misrepresents Africa as a jungle, is one thing they point out. The positive image framework, they note too, is too reductive, especially because positive is a relative term, and when a film dominates in positive images of a particular racial group, for example, or bends over backwards not to be racist, it can actually work to betray a lack of confidence in the groups being portrayed, and thus offer a racist depiction in any case. Naive integration also risks reinforcing the white terms of assimilation. The recognition of stereotypes can help to detect structural patterns of prejudice in what seemed before like random phenomena. And that's kind of what they want to emphasize, and why they think that noticing reading for these strategies is important. So an analysis of stereotypes should account for cultural specificity. Manthea Diawara's piece, sort of speaking to similar concerns and also building on feminist work to sort of extend to race. He notes how his theorization of the resisting spectator is indebted to feminist inquiry in film, though he also argues that gendered approaches to spectatorship often ignore race. Diawara points out how spectators are socially and historically, as well as psychically, constituted. Contemporary Hollywood films reinscribe the image of the castrated black male. He builds on Mulvey's argument and says that black characters are situated for the pleasure of white spectators, in a way similar to how women are situated for the pleasure of men in contemporary narrative cinema. Black characters are domesticated to white culture in most of the films that he's talking about, and are depicted as playing by the rules of white society and losing. And he gives the example of Eddie Murphy in several films he appeared in the 80s, functioning as a black character who's displaced into a white world, and again, playing by the rules of white society and losing. Diawara calls for an increase in spectator awareness of uncritical acceptance of Hollywood's products. And a question we can sort of ask about Diawara's essay here is how does his complication of the gaze produce new avenues for critique in some of the films we have seen so far featuring black characters? And this is one of the questions you can think about for this week, even for these films. So I want to dive in here and talk about these two Godzilla films. I want to begin with the 1998 version. And this week's a little different because I actually had difficulty finding too much literature written about either of these films. So I'm sort of going to give my own interpretation of these films, which is, again, something I'd encourage you to think about doing as a final project for a different film. So this particular film, I wouldn't quite classify as a horror movie, but it does sort of occupy this hybrid genre between, it has elements of romantic comedy we can see, it also has elements of action film, and some elements of horror, but it seems to be a non-characteristic horror. The film's opening credits sort of proposes that this Godzilla is the creation of nuclear testing, and the opening credits really suggest that it's actually just a big iguana. The geography of this film is important, I think, because we begin, because I think the film erases an association between U.S. nuclear weapons testing and the harmful effects. It sort of removes the U.S. and their responsibility in a long history of nuclear weapons testing in an interesting way. So the monster first attacks the ship in the South Pacific, and then we see it crossing Panama. It goes up to Jamaica, and then finally Manhattan or New York City. The French are involved in cleaning up the mess caused by French nuclear testing. The French really seem to be blamed in this film, even, and again, I think that's an interesting way of sort of erasing American responsibility for doing the same exact thing. So the film displaces American nuclear tests onto the French, it seems. America comes off as a passive victim of France's mistake, whereas Americans were the first to develop the test and to co-opt the South Pacific for nuclear testing. I'm also wondering if this film is set in Manhattan as sort of a pun in some way on the Manhattan Project, which is maybe meant to signal U.S. complicity in weapons testing, but I don't know. So one question I could ask is, why is this film set in Manhattan? And why is the 2014 version set in, I guess the real city under attack there is San Francisco? So some questions too. How does this film situate monstrous maternity or paternity in relation to eco-colonial exploitation via nuclear weapons tests? And does this film evacuate the original post-war context of Godzilla, which began as a 1950s post-war creation in Japanese cinema, as a metaphor for the type of weapons used by the U.S. at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? So, again, this creature, Godzilla, is a Japanese imagination of U.S. atomic and nuclear weapons. That's kind of the original metaphor that this monster was supposed to signify. So I guess I'm wondering if it's problematic for the U.S. to appropriate it, as Hollywood does in both of these films, by sort of downplaying the U.S. complicity in the creation of this monster. So let's meet our characters in this film. We have Nico Jatopoulos, who works for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He's an expert on the effects of nuclear radiation on animal life. His big insight seems to be that worms get bigger. When he's studying worms at Chernobyl, which he's seen doing here, gathering specimens. And he's also singing in the rain, so he's clearly happy in his sort of single lifestyle. Although we also get this glimpse that he has a picture of his old flame in his work kit, who he broke up with 8 years ago. And I guess I'm curious about the montage, the clash between these worms and these images of his old girlfriend, and whether that's supposed to associate her with something disgusting. We also meet Roche, the Frenchman, and I think his name associates him with the gross, disgusting creatures proliferating in New York City, right? Roaches, cockroaches, which has xenophobic overtones. But the insect can also supposedly survive nuclear winter, which seems to qualify this man as an opponent to the Godzilla creature and his nuclear associations, right? So the French are involved to clean up the mess caused by French nuclear testing. um, and it's interesting the way in which the French characters in this film seek to take full responsibility for this creature, which is why which is perhaps why the French team is killed off in Madison Square Garden, and why Roche um, um, well, yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like, the fact that the monster gets to New York perhaps has implications that the nuclear weapons tests have global consequences outside of the Pacific Rim. Um, Roche works for the French Secret Service. They hunt for the nest. This film sort of becomes about um, men looking for a monstrous father's nest. But he's also portrayed as a snob for sort of scoffing at donuts and bad coffee when the croissants are not available, and in that way, the film seems to be blaming the French for this New York City mess. This film is about Nick and Audrey's reunion, which can only happen with the help of this monster. Audrey can only be with Nick if she can feel validated in her job, but she is only validated in her job because she is the old flame of her first real scoop. This film won't let her succeed on her own without Nick. She builds her own career and rekindles her old relationship on Nick's success in destroying a monstrously gendered monster, right? So rather than aligning the monster's sexuality with the female protagonist, this film instead seeks to align Nick's asexual celibacy with the monster's asexual reproduction. Nick's monstrous paternity is what makes him compatible with the monster, or what makes him able to know the monster's secrets, right? So the point of the film seems to actually be to get Nick laid after 8 years without a love in his life. The male gaze is at work in how the audience is invited to identify with him, to sympathize with him when his lover betrays him, and to celebrate for him when he wins back the woman he has been pining over for the last 8 years. We're also introduced to Elsie Chapman of the National Institute of Paleontology, who, despite being a paleontologist, it shows immediate sexual interest in Nick, and her scientific contribution to this film seems to just be to be wrong, because her theory that this is a dinosaur from the Cretaceous period is proven wrong by Nick's theory that radiation is the clue, and that this is too big to be a dinosaur, and that radiation somehow proves that, right? So this movie, in essence, I don't think that either one of these films are feminist, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. So we're also introduced to Audrey, Nick's old flame. When we're introduced to her, she's being sexually harassed in her workplace by her boss, Mr. Kamen, who only considers her for a promotion if she will sleep with him. Her problem, according to her friend and Animal, her friend's husband, is that she's too nice to get ahead, right? Audrey confesses she hasn't made it since she left Nick. Her independence as a woman hasn't brought her anything. This film reinforces patriarchy by suggesting that her feminine independence isn't enough to get her ahead. She's a desperate reporter. She sort of cheats to get ahead. And Animal's wife scolds Animal for filling Audrey's head with this quote-unquote "you gotta be vicious" stuff again. So the film the message seems to be that being a strong, independent woman in this film is a bad idea. So Audrey reunites with Nick. She finds Nick in the middle of his purchasing pregnancy test, and she says in this line, "You must have some harem," which is an interesting way for them to reconnect. His sexual fertility contributes to the monstrousness of his fidelity to her. It seems odd that he's been so celibate, and yet he's purchasing these pregnancy tests, and she sort of reads that. She misreads that, right? She is sorry. She apologizes. She wants to know if Nick is still mad at her for wanting to pursue her own career, though apparently Nick is mad because she left without a note or without saying anything. So Nick's reunion with Audrey occurs at the same moment as he's discovering the monster is pregnant. So this sexual spark seems characterized by the monstrous. And I think we're supposed to read his celibacy as a kind of monstrous sexuality. Curious to know your thoughts on that. But so after they reconnect, Audrey undermines Nick and poses a threat to Nick. And it's interesting too to notice how her role is a very subordinate one in this film. She's only really defined in relation to Nick. Um, During a meeting, she steals this tape, and there's this meeting going on uh, among these generals, and they watch this report that seems to undermine Nick's credibility. Audrey's boss steals her report, right? So it also undermines her efforts. Her boss, Mr. Kamen's patriarchy, seems to step on her unethical means of acquiring the story. So Audrey represents a threat to Nick's patriarchal authority and credibility. It also seems significant that her story was revealing that there were eggs. And so it was an announcement of pregnancy, which was supposed to be delivered by a female reporter, but which was co-opted by a patriarchal boss. She does get the scoop here, but her passivity seems to be reinscribed. She only gets the scoop, her big story, was when she interviews Nick, but it's only at Animal's suggestion, right? She's in this bedroom feeling sorry for herself. She says, I totally screwed up with the only man who will ever care about me. But Animal comes in, and he's the one who sort of proposes that they try to go get this story. Animal suggests that her new story should be to follow Nick and to report on how he was right all along about the nest, about the pregnancy. And the fact that Animal is the one who proposes this reinforces that she can't really seem to have any original thoughts or ideas in this film. She doesn't seem to be a good reporter because men tell her what to report on, and she does it. So her passivity, it seems like, is reinscribed here. Animal says he's going to pursue Nick and she can follow him if she wants, and she does. So finally, she does interview Nick. Nick is sort of calling for the genocide of the species that they're still learning about. His theory of the creature nesting turned out to be correct after all. Audrey and Nick, their love is rekindled on camera. She sort of validates his theory at the same time that she gets this big story, this big break that she was waiting for. Audrey was unsure of how exciting Nick's life was. It suggested that that's one reason she didn't want to stay with him, was because he wasn't living this very exciting life. So again, this monster seems really important to this reunion that happens. Audrey quits, but only because she has her exclusive and gets her big scoop on being the ex-lover of the man who brought down Godzilla. So, a big question I have about this film, I think the big question, is why doesn't the film allow us to read Godzilla as female or as a mother? I'm wondering if this is a response to feminist critiques of horror. Is this a deliberate attempt to make sure the feminine is not aligned with the monstrous in any way? And if so, does the film succeed or fail in this endeavor? Gojira, or Godzilla, Gojira actually means gorilla whale in Japanese, but the film doesn't allow anyone to read Godzilla as female. Instead, the pronoun we get repeatedly is he, even though he lays eggs and gives birth to monsters which are also male, but are nevertheless born pregnant. So, right, so here's an example. He's pregnant. I mean, I'm wondering why we're reading this monster as male. It's not as if there is a giant prominent phallus that makes his masculinity apparent. I think his maleness, however, what I want to suggest here is that his maleness has more to do with Nick's effeminate sexuality. So we're told he's pregnant. He's a very unusual he. His gender shifts, just like the monsters or the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. And perhaps this illustrates how characters read its capacity for destruction as masculine. What changes about how the monster is represented? I'm curious about what changes about how the monster is represented when they realize it is a male who lays eggs. Does that make it a more destructive monster? Does that change how they read it? He also reproduces asexually, we're told, which again would seem to be an argument for using a different pronoun other than he. We're also told he's the first of his kind, and he doesn't have a precedent, much like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, and a lot of the creatures actually that we're talking about this semester. He's nesting in Manhattan. The animals travel a great distance for reproduction. We're told that a lizard can lay up to 12 eggs at a time. The governor assumes that eggs means there's a mate. So how can it be pregnant? Is this a virgin lizard? No, we're told it reproduces asexually. But the pronoun, again, stays away from the female. It gathers food for its young. And it's also significant, I think, that Animal and Nick are the ones who have cameras, because they're sort of controlling the male gaze, but then Roche in Madison Square Garden smashes them as if to destroy this evidence. And I also think it's interesting that when the babies are born, Nick tells us that they're born pregnant, even though they're also males. So they seem to just be duplicates of this father figure, I guess. Then there's in Madison Square Garden, there's this huge effort to have them contained inside so that they can blow them up. So there's the whole movie becomes about this masculine containment of a monstrous sexuality, but a sexuality that is read as male instead of female in this movie. And I think that masculine sexuality is even reinforced in Madison Square Garden, where there seems to be Nick makes them slip on all these basketballs and gumballs at one point, which I'm wondering if that can be read as a sort of Freudian symbol for masculinity going haywire or something. I don't know. But Nick sort of develops this relationship a few times. They have these moments where the monster, the father, Godzilla, and Nick behold this gaze, right? So Nick's connection with the creature is established when he takes a Kodak picture of it. And I guess I'm wondering, is he being compared to the creature for somehow being monstrously feminized, for remaining apparently asexual for 8 years since he was with Audrey? At the same time, Godzilla's not dead. The film wants you to think that Godzilla is dead, but he's not dead. He wants revenge later in the film. This isn't a mourning mother who's looking at her daughters. We're being asked to read this as a pissed off father. And this monstrous paternity seems to be what makes Totopoulos a formidable enemy to this monstrous father. Some other ways that masculinity play into this, I think, is when Roche starts his taxi with a knife, which sort of emphasizes the penetrative possibilities of being a man. They get swallowed by the monster when they're in the taxi cab, but they still read the monster as male. We're in his mouth, right? And Nick has a couple sentimental moments with this monster. They look at one another in the same way that Ripley and the Queen sort of face off in Aliens. But here it seems to be a paternal sympathy or relationship or something, like in this moment. So I guess I want to know more about what you think the connection is between these two as Nick watches Godzilla die. So thinking towards the 2014 film, the question I have is, what are some of the primary differences between these films? How do they reflect a different gender ideology or political framework? Do Yeah, like what's different about the political climate in the United States between 1998 and 2014. Um, the 2014 film functions more like Jurassic Park, I think, and compares the nuclear family to a nuclear family, which is a visual pun that's reinforced by the proximity of the nuclear facility to Ford's childhood home, right? His father works at a nuclear power plant. Um, so there's this nuclear family and a nuclear family, right? This film follows the male ego hero structure. It has a father lose his wife in the beginning of the film to nuclear radiation, which seems to later give rise to this monster. Ford has revenge by destroying the female Muto's eggs, and by doing so is able to protect and reunite with his family. The opening credits of this film are very similar to the 1998 film, but they show, shots of the origin of species cut with 50s military testing maps of the Bikini Atoll, where the U.S. tested nuclear weapons for years. Shots of Godzilla emerging from water at the same moment the bomb goes off. And this suggests the tests were really an effort to kill the monster, unlike the 1998 film, where Godzilla is the creation of nuclear tests, but a consequence of those tests nonetheless. Serizawa, later in the film, when he briefs Ford about what's going on, gives this narrative where the nuclear submarine, the Nautilus, awakens something when it makes its first voyage, and the tests in the 1950s were not tests, but an attempt to kill the monster. And interestingly, Godzilla in this film is also registers as him. The pronoun is male. There's also this background that Earth was once more radioactive than it is today. Radiation is a food source for these Muto creatures and for Godzilla. And Godzilla is sort of the restoring power for nature when it goes out of balance. Godzilla is summoned to restore that order, according to the mythology of this film. So the film also balances two families. We get Ford's family when he's a child and Ford's family when he's a father. As a child, Ford wants to celebrate his father's birthday. His father, Joe, ignores his wife's concern about the sign that Ford makes for him that says happy birthday, and immediately tells her what she needs to do when they get to work in the car. Right? He's very preoccupied. So Sandra seems to be responsible for managing the family's emotional energy. Joe is responsible for solving a more global problem, starting with the tremors in the Philippines. And this structure, this family structure where the masculine is concerned with global concerns and the feminine is concerned with emotional or domestic concerns, seems to be repeated in Ford's marriage with his wife later in the following scenes. The fact that Joe forgets his own birthday and doesn't understand that his son has made a sign for his birthday shows that he cares more about science than his children. And I think that suggests that he's also maybe a Frankenstein figure. But we can talk more about that next week. So we're introduced to Sam, who's Ford's son. He welcomes his father home the way Ford apparently never got to when his father went to work that day and the nuclear plant collapsed. There's a cake here that's eaten where it was sort of denied in the earlier part of the film. And a question that comes up here is, why is the viewer encouraged to believe that Ford's father dies with his mother? Is that supposed to signal a sort of symbolic death, that he sort of dies as a father and is no longer willing or able to take care of his son? Joe's obsession with echolocation and the sleeping Muto seemed to turn him into a bad father, so that eventually his son actually has to fly to Japan and bail him out of jail. This is another place where we can think about the racial politics of this film. Joe is one of two white men in a Japanese nuclear power plant, and he seems to be in charge. So I guess I'm wondering how a resisting spectator would read this, or how we're being asked to read this by Hollywood. Sandra's death potentially makes her a macho hero. It sort of haunts Joe that he sent his wife down there. He runs to save his wife, but he fails as a hero. Sandra stops to help Kenji, somebody who falls down. She radios and tells him to seal the door, that he has to live for their son. So yeah, I guess I'm wondering maybe how the hero roles are gendered in this film. Ford's son also asks him, "Are you still going to be here tomorrow?" Which sort of signals that Ford is an absent father. He tends to leave. He's actually an absent father for much of this film. He's concerned with global safety, where his wife is sort of more concerned with domestic safety. It's also important that Ford's job is to stop bombs. He works for the explosive ordnance disposal. We could think about a monstrous birth happening in this film, where, especially in this moment where we're told the pulses are seconds apart right before the Muto emerges from the nuclear power plant site, when it's sort of done feeding, which pulses being seconds apart, I don't know if we're supposed to read that as a sort of contraction, pregnancy contractions, similarity there. But the other thing that's important about this film is the way in which the gender ideology seems to build on top of environmental exploitation. So there are these parasitic spores, one dies and the other hatches in the Philippines, and this mining company drilling into its lair is actually what wakes up the creature, right? So similar to Aliens, the consequences of a masculine, corporate, colonial, environmental penetration, exploitation of land and natural resources is sort of what is causing the problem in this film, or what is responsible. The creature, we're told, absorbs radiation, and killing it would endanger the release of that radiation. But this film also isn't Aliens, and the monsters are not seeking revenge on the humans. Rather, this seems to be more of a Frankenstein narrative, I think, because the monsters are dependent upon human-produced radiation. This is about humans creating a monster they cannot control and that can potentially destroy them. And the message of the film also seems to warn about environmental exploitation in the Anthropocene. And again, Anthropocene, for those of you not familiar, is this term for the geologic epoch in which we're currently living, in which human behaviors influence climate change and environmental change on a measurable scale, right? So the monsters come alive as a result of human behavior. Unlike the earlier Godzilla, this film does feature a monstrous female with eggs visible, and here's a sort of a bad shot of that, but those glowing things in the mother's stomach. The wingless Muto is female. The female remained dormant until the male matured, and now they're seeking radiation to reproduce. Godzilla, in that sense, Godzilla and the army are sort of working together to stop a monstrous breeding, which raises questions about, won't these things all die if radiation runs out, or what? But I guess that's neither here nor there. Serizawa proposes that Godzilla can defeat them, and that's Godzilla's purpose. So in that sense, the audience sort of is supposed to just stand by and watch these monsters fight. He says the arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control and not the other way around. So Godzilla is really the object of the gaze here. And there does seem to be an argument for the army to stand down and let nature sort of take its course. The masculine army in this film seems to create more problems than it solves. So this film has potential to be a feminist narrative, a critique of the patriarchal order. However, it doesn't feature any strong female protagonists in the same way that Aliens does. The women are either nurturing mothers or monsters in this film. Serizawa's watch is an argument against nuclear warfare, since it's a holdover from Hiroshima from his father. This overall, this film is a story about a man trying to protect his family, trying to reunite with his family and his scared wife and their son. So we do get a shot of these baby Mutos, massive unidentified terrestrial organisms, and Serizawa seems confident that Godzilla can defeat them. They find the nest. Ford blows up the nest by opening a gas line. And we get a similar shot to the earlier Godzilla where this creature is sort of looking at Ford in a way. This is also calls back to Ripley and facing off with the aliens, this sort of face-off shot, right? But Godzilla ends up saving Ford here. He's sort of the Deus Ex Machina. And Godzilla rescues Ford from being vengefully devoured by the Muto. And then Godzilla kills the Muto with his atomic breath. But it's interesting that Ford, loses his mother in the beginning to a nuclear spill that was arguably caused by this creature. So there's a kind of revenge going on here. But Ford kills the Muto's nest. I guess I'm just wondering how we read the relationship between this Muto and Ford losing his own mother. Is the Muto a kind of vengeful form of his mother returning? How are you reading that? Ford regards the angry mother right as Godzilla charges up his atomic breath, which saves Ford. So Ford and Godzilla are sort of working together here to defeat this monstrous female. And then finally they're reunited. The nuclear family comes back together as Godzilla destroys the other nuclear family, right? So some questions we can think about for this week are, how does Diawara's complication of the gaze produce new avenues for critique in some of the films we have seen so far featuring black characters, including Godzilla, 1998, 2014. We can also think about Jeff Goldblum in The Fly and in Jurassic Park, Samuel L. Jackson in Jurassic Park. I'm curious how you bring his insights to these films. Another question is, how does horror participate or resist the racial representations offered by popular Hollywood cinema? Is horror a space to call attention to and critique some of the racial ideologies that Diawara is highlighting in the Hollywood films he discusses? How do these Godzilla films represent U.S. military practices in relation to the environmental colonialism with nuclear weapons tests in the South Pacific? There were plenty of victims of nuclear fallout in the South Pacific Islands where the U.S. and other European nations tested nuclear weapons for years, in addition to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So do these films attempt to call attention to the terror they faced, or are they sort of erasing that terror of nuclear fallout for something that's more kind of explosive and immediate? And finally, how do you understand the gender ideologies presented in these films? Another question, last question I have, is how does Audrey from Godzilla compare with Ronnie from The Fly in terms of being both reporters who are sort of acting as subordinate to the men that they are reporting on? So these are some questions I have. Again, I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on these films. And I look forward to reading your responses this week. Thank you.